Hey world, Didier here. I'm hearing a number of anti-racist colleagues at white-led institutions describe a specific challenge in taking up racial equity and racial justice work, a challenge in organizing our institutions around the movement for Black lives. And I want to offer a few reflections in support of how we might take up that challenge. There's a common complaint, which most often I'm hearing from white folks, that talking about racism is hard because the conversation quickly turns political. The subtext there being, we don't talk politics at work. Right? So, I'm going to offer some, what I hope can be clarifying reflections on this in support of our capacity to organize. Part of what's required is expanding our understanding and use and intentionality with the word political. It's often coded, usually suggesting something about bipartisan electoral politics, which is obviously charged right now. And I think we can expand our consideration of what we mean by the word political. Right? We can expand it. In fact, we have to, if we want to truly take up racial justice work in our institutions, rather than just giving it lip service. In my communities, or the communities that I'm a part of, when we use the word political, we're talking about a capacity and practice of analyzing differences in power. Differences in power. We're talking about bringing a lens that sees and critically analyzes how power is playing out in our relationships, in our culture, in our strategy, in our day-to-day life. We're talking about analyzing those differences in power so that we can come to a place of seeing what loving critique is required, right? We're in the business of lovingly critiquing ourselves and our institutions into wellness, right? We've got to be able to talk about power, if that's the case, in service of expanding possibilities for change. So, in other words, all social life is inherently political, we might assert. So the question is about how we're critically seeing it together in service of a more equitable world, which means that our lens must be political, right? And for many of us, that means a lens that's more political than ever before. The pandemic of police violence, racial terror, white supremacy, these are political. Our institutions are political, our teams, our families, all of our relationships are political. Because differences in power play out in all of these contexts. Whether we're talking about race, gender, sexual orientation, language, nation of origin, right? Differences of power play out in these contexts. And so these are the times to sharpen and practice a power analysis in our worlds. We need to bring a loving critique to how power moves in our worlds. Who's gatekeeping it? Who's being excluded? How are we holding ourselves accountable to the communities we're entangled with? How do we maintain that accountability? We need a power analysis that sees the way access to resources and formal authority, backed by culture, the way these things perpetuate oppression. And I say this as an English-speaking hetero Black man positioned in the United States. I say this as a human being. I say this as a member of community. So, we want to be more choiceful and more willful in service of beloved community. And we got to be political, if that's the case, right? Not shy away from these things. It's time to talk about power. Right? That said, in the context in which you're called to lead, right, how are differences in power showing up in your conversations? What impact are they having? And what's the tiny, small, low-risk experiment you can do to hold yourself more deeply accountable to community that you're entangled with? How will you maintain that accountability? These are questions I invite us to continue to ask, and for some of us to begin to ask. So I hope these reflections are generative for you. Either way, let me know. Thanks for listening.